This one's from Sports Illustrated. 3 Browns with the most to lose in training camp. I suppose you could say they have the most to gain as well at that point in time. Jerome Ford didn't do enough last season to entirely solidify himself as Cleveland's unquestioned feature back with Nick Chubb out. Elijah Moore. Moore was Cleveland's number 2 receiver in 2023 due to the arrival of Jerry Jeudy, emergence of second-year pass catcher Cedric Tillman in OTAs. Moore baby sliding down the depth chart even further. 3, Jack Conklin. 29-year-old has played a grand total of 22 games over the last 3 campaigns. Conklin, making his way back from injury, should be ready for the start of the season. Relative to Jack Conklin, football's a contact sport, and guys are going to get hurt. I mean, every time I see somebody say this guy's injury prone or that guy's injury prone, it's like, have you watched NFL football? It's physical, and guys get hurt.
Especially on the line. I mean, it's part of life on the offensive line. I mean, and the defensive line, obviously. But yeah, Jack Conklin's had some pretty unlucky years here over the last few years. I mean, 2021, not great. That's when he ended up with the ruptured patellar tendon in that Baltimore game, missed the rest of the year. He rebounded pretty nicely in 2022, was healthy for most of the way, and then, of course, just a freak injury last year in the opener against the Bengals. I do think that tackle situation is going to be really interesting. We obviously haven't really gotten to see him or Jedrick Wills yet out there. DeJuan Jones seems like he's coming around nicely, but look, I mean, I think lucky for the Browns and lucky for Jack Conklin, he already got his extension here, right? So I think the Browns are going to have to figure out what to do depending on how these guys progress injury-wise. Now, I think the Browns have always valued tackles. They are O-line snobs, as Andrew Berry said at the Combine this year. And I think it's important to remember last year they were down to their 4th and 5th starting tackles for that wild card game. That position really was decimated by injuries. So I do think that potentially has made them value the position even more than they already did. And that was a lot already before those injuries happened to Jed Wills, DeJuan Jones, and Jack Conklin. So I think going into the season, it's all about who's healthy. What are their different timelines like? Because these were different injuries, MCLs for Jed and DeJuan, and a couple ACL and MCL, I think, for Jack. So a more severe knee injury for him. He's gone through knee injuries before, but I'll be really curious to see what they do because I think everyone knows DeJuan Jones played really, really well last year when given the opportunity. So if everyone's healthy, it just feels like there is going to be an odd man out, and they're going to kind of have to figure out how to navigate that at that point.
And you mentioned, down to the 4th and 5th tackles, and they were there for a good part of the end of the season. That, in part, probably explains Jerome Ford, at least a little bit of the struggles that he had being consistent.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think last year was also just a really big learning experience for him. You know, it was his second year. They needed a lot more of him when Nick Chubb went down. And I do think they still really like Jerome Ford and what he can bring. But I do think there's some interesting competition in that room this year with Deontay Foreman, who does have a similar skill set to Kareem Hunt. But that's a different role than what I think they would want Jerome to play. And I do think even with Nyheim Hines, you look at him, he's the other new guy they brought in. The Browns are going to need him in the return game, I'm guessing. Now they're trying out all their skill players there, but Nyheim Hines is a really, really good returner. Fans may remember him. He is the one who, when he was with the Bills, returned the opening kickoff for a touchdown in their first game back after everything happened with Damar Hamlin against the Bengals a couple of years ago. So he's a really good returner who's coming off of an ACL injury of his own. But I think both those guys play a different role than Jerome. So I'm really curious to see how this shakes out, especially with new position coach Deuce Staley. But I think last year was a learning experience for Jerome, and I do think they like how he can get involved in the pass game too, potentially. We saw that a little bit, and Pierre Strong I even saw doing some of that in OTAs and minicamp. He's kind of the forgotten guy in this room, but I think they still really like him as well. So that running back depth behind Nick Chubb is going to be really interesting. Of course, Nick Chubb is still king, but again, I'm curious to see how these roles look if Nick Chubb isn't back immediately in week 1 from his knee injury, and who's doing what, because I do think there's room for multiple contributors without him.